Hello and welcome to another Giant Slayer TFT Top 5 Countdown video. Today we'll be taking a second look at what the 11-15B meta has become with the top 5 comps. A lot has changed over the course of the patch and we've reached the point where the meta seems to have settled down. We'll take a look at which compositions have fallen out of favor and which ones have risen to the top. Keep in mind there's no patch this week, so the current meta is likely to remain unchanged for a little while longer. With all that said, let's go ahead and get started. But before we begin, please don't forget to click the links in our description. Give your support to everyone who helped make this video happen. We host many TFT tournaments with plenty of exciting content to come. Be sure to also follow our Giant Slayer TFT social media pages. Alright, let's get back to the video. Starting off our top 5, we have Yasuo coming in at number 5. There's quite a few compositions that could be in this spot on the list. Yasuo wins out over those builds because of an important factor: consistency. Consistency in this case refers to how well a composition performs against the other top meta builds. Yasuo, thanks to his true damage, does well against most other top comps. Worried about Ironclad, Mystic, or just defensive stats in general? Yep, true damage. Because of that, Yasuo has consistently remained a viable top 5 comp throughout the ups and downs of the 11-15 meta. Not much has changed in terms of how players go about running Yasuo as a carry. First off, 3-starring him is key to doing well in the late game. While you can get by with only Yasuo 2, if you want to place higher than 4th, you definitely need to 3-star him. Next, the build hasn't changed all that much. Primarily, you're going to be using Nightbringer plus a mix of whichever traits you need. Most commonly, you'll see Yasuo with 6 Nightbringer, 2 Legionnaire at level 7. There's some wiggle room here by dropping down to 4 Nightbringer, but generally no lower than that, as Nightbringer is the key to increased survivability for Yasuo. The real importance for Yasuo are still items. RFC helps immensely in preventing him from running around in melee, so be sure to try to have that item secured when you're playing Yasuo. Burns Hurricane is also another best in slot item as it helps spread out the true damage of its ability. Lastly, any AP item is fine in the 3rd slot, though most commonly it ends up being Hand of Justice. As for Radiant items, any version of his regular items are fine to use. Overall, Yasuo is a composition you try to play when you have a good opening. Generally, this means an early Yasuo with items to give him. From there, you can roll at level 7 or 8, play for Yasuo 3, and enjoy a top 4. Let's move on to the composition coming in at number 4, Lucian. Lucian has fallen down in priority as this composition originally came in at 2nd on our first top 5 composition video for 11-15. Since then, the meta has changed several times to where it is now, a meta dominated mainly by AP comps. But AD carries are still playable, with Lucian being the best of them. What makes Lucian viable as a carry is his consistent damage output, even against hard-to-kill front lines. The key here is utilizing the right items mixed with his 2 traits, Sentinel and Cannoneer. When it comes to items, you will for sure need Last Whisper. This is because of Bramble Vest and Ironclad. Ironclad is really easy to splash in at level 7 and 8, and is the easiest counter to AD comps. Bramble not only adds a lot of armor, but makes critical hits far less impactful. Thus, having Last Whisper is essential when running Lucian as a carry. Deathblade is another item worth having as it adds a lot of extra damage to his ability. Infinity Edge can also be a worthwhile investment since it pairs well with Last Whisper. As for traits, the build hasn't changed all that much, with 6 Sentinel, 4 Cannoneer still being the easiest way to play Lucian. But there's always the option of dropping down to 3 Sentinel to fit in other synergies like Ironclad, Mystic, or Revenant. It really comes down to what you're able to hit and whether or not you need to tailor your board to counter other players. There's 2 more important factors to consider when playing Lucian. The most important is positioning. You need to be diligently scouting and repositioning your Lucian so that you get the most value from his ability, otherwise his effectiveness falls off. Keep in mind he targets the furthest away enemy champion, so use that knowledge to position him accordingly. The second factor is Akshan. Akshan is the late game insurance plan when running Lucian since he fits in well as a Sentinel. Plus, he adds in more damage, armor reduction, and is an all-around solid 5-cost champion. Having a 2-star Akshan is a surefire way to top 3 with a Lucian build. Lastly, Lucian is heavily contested. Be sure to scout to see if other players are contesting you, as you may need to pivot into a different build. If you've already committed AD items, Aphelios is an okay option, as is playing for Akshan carry. Scout and be willing to pivot if needed. Now we can get into the meat and potatoes of the meta, starting with the number 3 composition, Velka's Redeemed. Yep, Velka seems to be back. We've seen AP comps rise up in the meta for a few reasons. One reason is the nerfs to Forgotten Cavalier and Soraka, leading to fewer early game comps. Because the pace of the game has slowed down a bit, it means mid to late game compositions are more popular. Plus, as we've been on this patch for quite a while, players have improved at playing for the late game. Put all those factors together and it makes sense that we've shifted towards late game AP-oriented boards. Velka swoops in to take his place among those builds because he does quite a bit of damage and has Redeem to back him up. Redeem provides a lot of extra stats and helps a lot in the late game. Plus, the champions allow you to easily splash in traits like Ironclad and Mystic, adding even more defense to the board. Velka also does well against most of the other meta comps. Of course, doing well against those builds requires proper positioning. The main issue with Velka is if you're not willing to scout and sweat your positioning every single round, it's not worth running him as the carry. There's a huge difference between a well-positioned Velka and one that never gets repositioned. So we recommend not using him as a carry if you're not willing to get just a bit sweaty. As for the comp itself, the most common one is 6 Redeemed with whatever extra traits you want. Be that Invoker, Revenant, Mystic, or Ironclad. Base your decision on what you hit in the lobby you're in. There's other ways to run Velka, such as with Abomination, but we're sticking mostly to the Redeem version for now. Keep in mind you can always pivot out of your Velka if you find Heimerdinger late game. This is easy to do because Velka's items are essentially the same, with Shojin being a must-have and any AP damage items filling the other slots. Overall, Velka is likely the best 4-cost carry that you can run as long as you're willing to scout and reposition often. Up next, we have Abomination Draconic coming in at number 2. Well, look at which composition has risen from the dead. Okay, it wasn't completely dead after the hotfix early on in 11.15, but Abomination certainly fell out of favor for some time. But as we mentioned, the pace of the game has slowed down, which means Draconic is a viable option once again. And players realize that Abomination is still really strong in the early stages of the game, leading us to where the meta is now, with Abomination being one of the most played traits. There are a few important details regarding Abomination Draconic. First off, you need Draconic relatively early in the game, preferably no later than the end of Stage 2. This is because you need time for the eggs to spawn and hatch. Another detail is items for the monstrosity. There's a wide range of viable options, but prioritizing defensive items works best so the monstrosity can actually do its job as a tank to buy time for your backline. The last important detail is making sure you secure a Shojin. Shojin is the key item for practically every carry you may want to play with Abomination. Whether that's Zyra, Heimerdinger, Velka, or even Teemo. All of them do well with Shojin, specifically Heimerdinger. Speaking of carry, Zyra 3 still works just fine if you're able to hit it before finding Heimerdinger. Otherwise, pivoting into Heimer is almost always the better option. All in all, this composition is easy to run but does require a bit of luck to find Draconic early enough. Ideally, you want to also find Abomination early, but it scales better than Draconic does. And since there's multiple carry options in the mid to late game, it's actually quite a flexible composition, making it all around the best in the meta. And coming in at number 1 is Heimerdinger carry. We've already mentioned him a few times, but Heimerdinger is by far the best late game champion in the current meta. And since we've reached the point where the 11.15 meta is quite figured out, it's likely we'll continue to see Heimer dominating the late game until 11.16. It's important to keep in mind that Heimerdinger isn't a specific composition, but is the end goal for a lot of boards. This is made easier by most mid-game builds being capable of pivoting into Heimerdinger, specifically Velka and Abomination. Abomination is likely the easiest board to pivot into Heimerdinger, but honestly any build can do well as long as you have items for Heimerdinger, specifically Shojin. Revenant and Invoker are also two important traits to have when running Heimer carry. Ivern, Volibear, and Fiddle buy you a lot of time in the front line, especially in conjunction with champions like Rel or the Monstrosity from Abomination. Invoker is easy to add in and helps with Heimer's large mana pool. Overall, the strongest capped late game board in the current meta is almost always going to be running Heimerdinger as the main carry. That's going to be it for our second look at the top 5 comps of patch 11.15. Before we go, we have a few honorable mentions to talk about. Our first honorable mention is Aphelios. Aphelios started off strong, but has slowly fallen out of favor as 11.15 has gone on. This is mainly because Aphelios takes too much time to ramp up in fights. At first, this wasn't really a problem due to the meta being new and players not optimizing their front lines. But now it's easy for players to splash in counters to Aphelios that reduces overall effectiveness. Since optimized front lines are more common, it means Aphelios has difficulty doing enough damage to get access to the enemy backline. Thus, the most effective way to play Aphelios is with a secondary carry, the best being Akshan. But that's difficult to do, which puts Aphelios in the same position he was prior to the mid-set. To play him effectively, you need to have the right items, to be level 8, hit Aphelios 2, and have the right 5-cost champion as well. If you meet all those requirements, great, Aphelios is playable. Without them, well, you're going to have a hard time consistently top 4ing. Next, we have Reroll Tristana. Tristana with Hellions is the most consistent reroll composition in the meta, but even then it's still hit or miss because most late game boards will outscale Trist 3. Still, the value of running this composition is for the mid game power spike once you hit Tristana 3. That should be enough to carry you into a top 4. Just keep in mind that even with the best positioning, sometimes Tristana will run down and die in the enemy backline. This is especially true against Heimerdinger and Velkas. As long as you're aware of the risks, Tristana reroll is fine to play. And the last honorable mention we have for today is Forgotten Cavalier. We wanted to acknowledge that this composition, despite being nerfed, is still playable. Unfortunately, it's quite inconsistent and we only recommend playing it under perfect conditions. This means you're hitting your upgrades quickly and no one is contesting you. That said, if you can hit Hecarim 3 with good defensive items along with Misfortune 3, then you can definitely still top 4 with the build. It won't be as consistent as Tristana, but it's certainly worth knowing how to play to squeak out a top 4 every once in a while when the stars align. That's going to be it for today, folks. As mentioned, there's no patch this week. Because of that, the meta is in a stable place, making it the best time to climb since the top comps have been figured out. Let us know in the comment section below what compositions you've been climbing with the most. Thank you for watching, and if you're enjoying our content, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe for future Giant Slayer TFT videos.